Increasingly, colleges and universities are recognizing the systemic barriers embedded in processes, policies, and structures that limit the full and equal participation of members of equity-seeking groups. As such, there's a growing interest in recruiting faculty that understand the importance of embedding equity, diversity, and inclusion in their teaching, research, and service. My name is Jenny Flagler George, Senior Manager of Research Equity in the Office of Research. And over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to be walking you through some tips and tricks for preparing a diversity statement within your academic job application. Again, increasingly, this is a requirement that many applicants will be seeing as part of the overall application package for applying to a university or college. And part of this reason is that equity, diversity, and inclusion considerations are increasingly required as part of major grant opportunities, including as part of the training and development plan and within the research design itself. And this is largely because research indicates that embedding equity, diversity, and inclusion in these areas may contribute to more ethical, innovative, and relevant research outcomes. So what is a diversity statement? Your diversity statement describes how your commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI, affects your personal development, how you interact with others, including members of equity-seeking groups across staff, faculty, and student groups, your approach to supporting the learning and development of others through research, teaching, service, and leadership. This is the broad description of elements in a diversity statement. However, to really drill down into what this means and what pieces should be incorporated, over the next half an hour, I'm going to focus on 5 key areas to consider, including values and understanding of EDI, evidence of engagement with EDI in teaching, evidence of engagement with EDI in research, engagement with EDI through service, and efforts to support inclusive mentorship and skills building. And this content is largely adapted from Inside Higher Ed's Breaking Down Diversity Statements. This was a very well done paper and builds off the work of Chavus's paper that was recently presented at the annual meeting of the Association for the Study of Higher Education and analyzes faculty equity, diversity, and inclusion statements required for applicants to a postdoctoral fellow to faculty program, looking at what factors were key in presenting effective diversity statements. So in understanding EDI, we begin with a definition of key terms, and I won't spend a significant amount of time here, but it is important when you're preparing your diversity statement to really have a solid handle on key terms, because often there's a belief that we know what these terms mean, but there's nuances and definitions that I think are important. And these definitions in particular, I've adapted from the New Frontiers in Research Fund, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Best Practice Guide. Equity is the removal of systemic barriers and biases, enabling all individuals to have equal opportunity to access and benefit from a program, policy, or practice, which would include the research enterprise and training environment for students. So here, access is key because the resources required to gain equitable access may be different across different groups where systemic barriers may have limited participation in the past or ongoingly. Systemic barriers within that definition result from institutional level practices, policies, traditions, and values that may be unintended or unseen, but have serious and long-lasting impacts. For example, a systemic barrier may be where a candidate is judged for their research output after taking 1 year of parental leave to the same standards of output as someone who did not have that same year-long parental leave. So judging across the same standards of output would inadvertently disadvantage that person who had taken parental leave because they would be judged by an unfair yardstick. Diversity are the differences in race, color, place of origin, religion, immigrant and newcomer status, ethnic origin, ability, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and age. And inclusion are ensuring that all individuals are valued, respected for their contributions, and equally supported to create an environment where all individuals feel they belong. I want to take a minute to emphasize that at times there is a tendency to conflate diversity and inclusion. In order to support inclusion of diverse groups, we need to focus on that feeling of belonging, because that requires concrete action to support a sense of belonging. There must be programs or policies or structures put in place to encourage that sense of belonging where it has been lacking. Equity-seeking groups are communities that face significant collective challenges in participating in society, including the research enterprise. So for example, this could include women, LGBTQ2+ folks, racialized groups, Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, people who are exercising cultural or religious practices, and any intersection of these identities. We know that members of the equity-seeking groups have been historically challenged through facing significant collective challenges in participating in society, including the research enterprise, and that members of these groups have experienced a long-standing bias in areas such as recruiting, hiring, and training. And as a result, again, have been underrepresented in the research enterprise more broadly. So as part of the diversity statement, as you'll see moving forward, how you support an inclusive environment and go about your own practices with students will be important. Moving into that first of 5 section, values and understanding of EDI. So these are some areas that you'll want to consider when you craft this portion of your diversity statement. You can include a statement of support for advancing the values of equity, diversity, inclusion, or EDI. Show your commitment by highlighting training that you have completed individually related to areas of equity, diversity, and inclusion. For example, anti-racism training. You could share your personal experiences as they relate to your commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion through your own background, though depending on level of comfort, you may not want to do that, and that's okay as well. You could describe your understanding of systemic barriers that impact staff, faculty, students. This may take additional work so that you understand what those systemic barriers are, particularly as they relate to the institution that you are applying to. You may also want to review the diversity statement and context of the institution you're applying to, as they may have specific equity or inclusion strategies underway. When you're building out these areas of understanding systemic barriers and the context of the institution applying to, consider asking yourself questions related to how experiences for some populations may differ from others. And what are the current equity-related initiatives underway that you could really draw on and build upon? Now, over the next slides, for each of the 5 sections, I'm going to provide you with some areas to focus on, as I have here, and then get into a bit of an example of how each of these areas come together in a sample statement. This is not intended as a template because, of course, your diversity statement needs to reflect your own commitment and experiences, but it is intended to provide you with a sample of how these elements can come together in one place. Again, you don't need to pull in all of these elements, but it just provides you with some ideas for consideration. I also know this slide is very dense, so my apologies, but as this is a virtual webinar, I wanted to provide you with enough context to look back on and to go through. So for values and understanding of EDI, I regard equity and diversity as an integral part of academic excellence, and I'm committed to accessibility for all students. As such, I support equitable learning opportunities through my teaching for members of equity-seeking groups. Research indicates that Black, Indigenous, and people of color continue to be underrepresented in my field due to recruitment practices that limit access for students from BIPOC communities. I appreciate your public commitment to ending systemic racism in your institution. I'm committed to contributing to concrete efforts to address systemic racism, including leading faculty-based initiatives as part of your campus-wide initiative currently underway, such as the open dialogue forums to be held in 2021. So here we see that we're opening with a statement of support for advancing EDI, that the person is familiar with some of the systemic barriers that exist more broadly in the field of research. If you put something like this in, I also recommend that you do research so that you can put specific context to your field of research, including potentially representation data if available. That you're also familiar with the institution's current campus initiatives underway, and that you commit to participating in it. And by putting specifics such as the open dialogue forums in this example, you can provide evidence that you've really thought through this and are genuinely interested. Moving on to evidence of engagement with EDI in teaching, consider how you advance EDI through your course curricula. For example, do you include course readings from underrepresented scholars? Do you show that you are considering diversity of thought, perspective, and experience? You may discuss how you intend to support accommodations for students. So for example, do you include accommodations information in your syllabi? How can students access materials in an alternative format if needed? Do you provide additional office hours? Is there a note taker available? What intentional efforts have you made or would you commit to? You may also include pedagogical practices related to EDI. For example, consider how you make space for all students to participate. Have you considered different forms of communication or different preferences? For example, those who prefer more individualized work or those who prefer more collaborative group work. How do you promote a climate of inclusivity? For example, do you include an equity statement within your syllabi? Do you make it noted at the beginning of class that all values or all perspectives and experiences will be welcomed in class so long as it's a safe space and dialogue is respectful? These are areas that you can consider when you're discussing your commitment to teaching, which you may be able to draw on either experience as an instructor or teaching assistant that you can really embed within your diversity statement. To provide you with an example of these elements coming together, in developing course content, I emphasize the value of diversity of thought and perspective provided by scholars of all backgrounds, including intentionally seeking research from members of underrepresented groups in my field. Here in your statement, you may also wish to provide some specific examples to show that this is not just lip service. I embed a focus on EDI in my course by assigning a paper requiring students to complete a gender-based analysis plus of a research study to identify gaps and areas for improvement. I seek to provide an inclusive classroom by including information for how to access accommodations on the syllabus, designing multiple opportunities for engagement for students who communicate in unique ways, and by publicly advocating the value of diversity to all students at the beginning of term and ongoingly throughout the course. So here we see that the value of diversity of thought and perspective from diverse scholars is included through assigned readings, that there is a paper that includes a GBA plus analysis, which focuses on supporting an analysis that factors equity-related concerns and factors into research design, and effort made to provide an inclusive environment, as well as really noting that EDI is a value to students within the class. Moving on to evidence of engagement with EDI in research. You may wish to focus on populations within your research that you consider. For example, populations with a research engaging or impacting individuals from equity-seeking groups or underrepresented groups. You may focus on inequality in your research, supporting a greater understanding of mechanisms that create inequality. For some folks, you may not feel that these areas really are relevant to your research. It may be very technical in nature, but in these cases, I also direct you to consider knowledge dissemination practices that you use. For example, consider who is impacted by your research findings. Will some benefit more than others, or is it more relevant to some than it is to others? And how will you provide access to the findings of your research to ensure that you reach broad groups and include those who may typically not have access to these research findings, despite the fact that it would be broadly applicable to them. You may also want to note any collaborations, including recruitment of diverse teams that you've engaged with in the past, and partnerships with those who have relevant expertise and knowledge, but may not be within the academic context. For example, community partners or participants that have diverse perspectives and important information to add to your research. So to show you an example of how some of these elements can come together, my research builds on existing scholarship and addresses equity-related gaps as I consider sex as a factor when evaluating the efficacy of cardiovascular interventions in mice, given that previous research has focused exclusively on male mice. I also use my findings to identify mechanisms by which human females are disadvantaged in the development of new medications based on animal trials using only male samples that are framed as generalizable to all groups. In disseminating my findings, I make public presentations, including targeting presentations to professional medical associations tailored to women's health. As an understanding of GBA plus, or gender-based analysis plus, is essential for my research, I have formalized interdisciplinary research with established researchers who have expertise in this area. So to go over how some of these elements are coming together, you can see that we've started with talking about the population, including sex as a key factor for consideration, and then moved on to inequality by saying that the findings will be used to identify mechanisms by which human females are disadvantaged in the development of new medications. So that speaks to inequality as a focus. And then knowledge dissemination through making public presentations, including targeting presentations to professional associations tailored to women's health, because again, this is relevant for the specific research topic and reaches that intended broader audience. And then finally, finishing with formalized partnerships or interdisciplinary research projects that include those who have expertise in GBA plus analysis. So again, that speaks to intentional collaborations that address areas of potential equity-related gaps. Moving on to engagement with EDI through service. We're going to look at things like efforts to develop institutional policies or practices related to EDI, participation in organizations or professional associations with a mandate to support the inclusion of members of equity-seeking groups. So to provide an example of the first, for developing institutional policies or practices, have you been a part of any associations or groups that have advocated for changes related to institutional policies or practices? And if so, what have been the outcome of these efforts? Have you participated in any on-campus associations that support members of equity-seeking groups? Again, when you're considering these areas, think back to that definition of equity-seeking groups to ensure that you've really considered all areas that you may have made significant impact. If you haven't yet, also as a side note, if you haven't yet been involved in any of these things, as you look forward to your future and your preparation of diversity statements for academic job positions, consider becoming involved. It's never too late, and you can always focus on an area that you would be passionate in contributing to. Next, participation in campus initiatives or projects focused on building an inclusive environment. So here you can consider any activity in, say, public lectures, campus events, anything that you've participated in that's targeting improving an inclusive environment, particularly looking at addressing barriers for members of equity-seeking groups. To pull in a current example, at the University of Waterloo, the President's Anti-Racism Task Force, or faculty-specific task forces similarly that have been launched, including the Science Anti-Racism Task Force, for example. Where possible, throughout your statement, and particularly in this area, be specific with your information. So here, be specific with what your role was and is related to these areas of service and the frequency of engagement to really help to frame your participation for those who are reading your diversity statement. So here's the example. As a graduate student, I acted as the representative for my department for the Graduate Students Association, where I focused on supporting recommendations to implement equitable recruitment and selection strategies for research assistantships. The outcome of this work was the faculty-wide adoption of guidelines for broader recruitment designed to increase the diversity of graduate students in the pool of potential candidates. Outside of the academic context, I have been a member of the Grand River Accessibility Committee for 4 years, where I advocate for accessible public spaces, including enhancing access to regional transit for those with visual impairments. So you can see in this example, I want to note that it's not necessary to only think specifically to the contributions you've made in your campus environment, but that you can also think broadly to any participation that you have in the community more broadly. So again, we have very tangible specifics included. We have the name of the committees or groups that this person has been a part of, the duration, in terms of the 4 years in the Grand River Accessibility Committee, and also the outcome of this work in certain areas. So the outcome of participation in the Graduate Students Association Committee for this person was the adoption of specific guidelines. Now, this content is, again, going to be very specific to your context. So clearly this is not intended as a template. This is just a hypothetical example, but hopefully it will jog your attention to certain areas that you can also really build on for yourself. Final section, efforts to support inclusive mentorship and skills building. And this may include strategies that you've used to support students or peers also through mentorship, including programming targeted to members of equity-seeking groups. So it may be that you participated in mentorship programs or also peer-to-peer support programs, including potentially things like peer support for campus mental health. Think of all of the activities that really can be framed as mentorship, because these are very valuable, as we know that to support retention of members of equity-seeking groups, as well as across the board, we really need to build an inclusive environment, because without that inclusive environment, we may be recruiting folks to come on board so students to take a certain program. But if there's not that inclusive environment, then it's not going to support ongoing retention, which is really that goal, to build a strong pipeline for excellent researchers of all backgrounds. You may also want to focus on your contributions to building the skills of others. This could also be, for example, taking on an informal or formal mentorship role of more junior graduate students or undergraduate students in a lab space or a training environment, and what kind of support you provided. Again, be as specific as possible. Also consider efforts undertaken to promote the importance of an inclusive environment to members of equity-seeking groups. So this, again, can include anything that you've really led in this area or participated in. And to finish off with a statement here, Indigenous students continue to be underrepresented in STEM fields. To support mentorship and role modeling, I actively participate in the Indigenous Student Center outreach program. Specifically, I lead annual summer camp workshops designed to build an interest in STEM among Indigenous children and youth. I've taken concrete steps to build an inclusive environment on campus by participating as the student representative on the research working group of the indigenization strategy. Through this work, I learned the importance of Indigenous ways of knowing, and I intend to bring this knowledge to my future institution. So here again, we have focusing on clearly identifying systemic barriers that exist and how this person has contributed through a mentorship role and role modeling. And again, there's specific content related to how they've participated, which is that annual summer camp workshops, and what the intent of these workshops are. And then further expanding beyond that, this person has also participated in the indigenization strategy working group. It's where relevant, it's important to also finish off with what you have learned through your activities and your contributions. For this person in this example, they've learned the importance of Indigenous ways of knowing. So the institution that this individual is applying to will now understand that they have some level of knowledge and then also a commitment to bringing this forward. So at the end here, we focus on the fact that this person intends to bring this knowledge to the future institution. Where possible, as we're coming to an end, I recommend finishing your diversity statement with a forward look. So how will you bring what you have learned in other areas to your institution that you are applying to? Be specific and concrete. And again, this can bring it back to the context of the institution. So at the outset, you laid out your awareness of the initiatives and their value related to equity, diversity, and inclusion and a diverse environment. So when you finish up, bring it back to that and talk about how your experiences in each of these 5 key areas will really support you in building their campus community. Thank you very much for your attention during this session, and I wish you the best of luck with preparing your diversity statements for your academic job applications.